A couple of years ago, I was paging through a magazine such as you may have seen yourself in some doctor or dentist waiting room. The magazine was entitled Natural History. Have you ever seen it? It's a magazine with articles about animals and lifestyles in different parts of the earth. It's produced by the American Museum of Natural History in Central Park West in New York City. The particular copy I was paging through had an article that caught my attention. It showed a picture of a man on a bicycle driving down a crowded street, looked like Lower Manhattan in New York. And the article was entitled, "I'd Rather Be a Messenger." Underneath it, it said, New York City's bicycle messengers prefer the independence and excitement of dodging traffic to the routine of a 9-to-5 job. It discussed these men who, with a small pack on their back, zoom around the concentrated part of Manhattan, delivering small packages and letters faster than the postal service would. Many of them unable to hold down normal 9-to-5 jobs. But in looking at that article, there was a paragraph that particularly caught my attention and I think will be of interest to you. Here in this section, the paragraph said, "Sometimes messengers have left former careers for reasons other than personality conflict. Donald, a 41-year-old messenger, is able to support his wife and 15-year-old son on his earnings. Donald was a film processor, but abandoned his profession because, as a Jehovah's Witness, he could not condone the role he played in producing pornographic material. As a messenger, not only does he feel his conscience is clear, but he can also leave work at his own discretion to devote more time to proselytizing for his creed." So right here in this article on the strange subject of bicycle messengers, a paragraph devoted to one of our brothers. All we know is his name is Donald. He had a wife and son, and he was working for a company that processed film. Maybe the sort of place where after you go on your vacation up to Oregon's coast or Crater Lake, you put your film in a little envelope and you send it off to a company. They process the film and then you get back your prints or slides. That sort of place Donald was working at. But it says at some point, Donald, who was just an employee there, decided to change his job and to become just a bicycle messenger. And the underlying reason was Donald, our brother, wanted to continue to have a good relationship with God. Later on in our discussion today, we're going to analyze what he did, why, and then sort of compare it to your circumstance in life, or mine, and see if we can draw certain conclusions from it. But at the outset, it's worth noting that he wanted to have a good relationship with God. And that's totally understandable. When you think about it, who do you want to have friendships or relationships with? Are they not people who are kind, generous, interested in you, passionate, warm? That's the sort of individual you'd like to have a relationship, friendship with, isn't it? You think back to when mankind was first put on the earth, Adam and Eve, there was every reason for them to want to have a good relationship with God because here God gave them a paradise to live in. It was a perfect place. They enjoyed good weather. They had an abundance of food to eat. They had the prospect of having children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and just continuing to see the human family in perfection expand, the gradual increase in the paradise. And all of this was, of course, a gift from God. So would you, if you were in that situation, want to have a good relationship with Him? Would you not want to avoid anything at all, that might interfere with your relationship with God, sully that relationship? But back in Adam's situation, when you think about it, say you were there, you were Adam or Eve, what would you do or avoid doing so as to be sure your relationship with God would continue good and strong? God didn't provide for Adam a long list of do's and don'ts, did he? He just picked out one tree and he said, now, for my own reasons, I'm putting a symbolic meaning on that, and don't eat from that tree, but all of the rest of the healthy, fruitful trees and plants of the garden you may eat of and enjoy good health and perfection. How about the other things, though? As the human family increased, as there came to be children and grandchildren and weddings and in-laws, and there'd be a lot of decisions to make. How would the human family, Adam and Eve included, make those decisions in a way that God would approve of, so they wouldn't hurt their relationship with God? It wasn't that God gave them a Talmud of rules covering every decision. Instead, Adam and Eve, first of all, must have had the desire mentioned over here in the 25th Psalm. Of course, this psalm is not written about Adam and Eve directly. It's written later on by David. But they must have had this same sort of attitude as we ought to if we want to have a good relationship with God. Psalm 25, the psalmist wrote in verses 4 and 5, "Make me know your own ways, O Jehovah. Teach me your own paths. Make me walk in your truth and teach me, for you are my God and salvation." So Adam and Eve must have had an interest or a desire to get to know God better, because the closer they knew God and what he was like, the more easy they could reflect him and do things that he would approve of and avoid things that he might disapprove of. God, though, provided for Adam and Eve something that you and I also have. He gave them an innate internal capacity that would help them in making decisions so as to have a good relationship with him. And that internal capacity is mentioned in the Bible book of Romans chapter 2, mentioned by the Apostle Paul in a discussion of how individuals could be sort of right with God. And Paul talks about two classes of individuals: the Jews, who had the Mosaic law, and the non-Jews or Gentile peoples and nations that did not have the Mosaic law. And notice the reference here to this innate capacity that God gave them in Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. Whenever people of the nations that do not have law, that is the Mosaic law, do by nature the things of the law, these people, although not having law, are a law to themselves. They are the very ones who demonstrate the matter of the law to be written in their hearts, while their conscience is bearing witness with them, and between their own thoughts they are being accused or even excused. So here reference is made to this internal capacity called conscience. What is conscience? Well, it's this internal moral sense that it enables an individual to evaluate an act or decision and reach a judgment, a moral judgment on it. Probably you felt it. Maybe sometime you were asked a question and you, no, I didn't do that. And, what you said wasn't really the truth. And then afterward, you just feel upset, so upset that you might even go back and tell the person the truth. That is the operation of this intangible, innate capacity that we call conscience. The Apostle Paul here suggests that all people, whether Jew or Gentile, that all people have conscience. And in fact, there's evidence of that, because we see people who are isolated tribal people, and even though they've never heard of the Bible, they have certain fundamental laws, perhaps against incest, adultery, murder, rape, stealing. Now, why is it that virtually all people have these same fundamental laws? Well, the answer seems to be that they have conscience. In fact, I read an article in Time magazine a couple of years ago about a Harvard professor named Jerome Kagan, and it seems that there was a certain prevailing psychological view that individuals learned morality by how they grew up. Their family taught them morality or conscience. But this Jerome Kagan from Harvard went down to Central America, and among a very isolated tribal people there, he studied them, and he came back with a changed viewpoint. He said, our culture is doing something very dangerous by saying that morality is learned. That if a 15-year-old kid mugs an old lady, he probably never learned a conscience. I think that all children, provided that they have an intact nervous system, know before they're 3 that hurting another is wrong. We can expect a conscience of every child. We don't have to build it in. So this Harvard professor is finally coming around to a conclusion that had he read the Bible, was written down there almost 2,000 years ago, that everybody fundamentally has this capacity of conscience. And that conscience can help people in making decisions so as not to sully or hurt their relationship with God. So we face a decision, now what should I do? Well, conscience may help us to make that decision. Or after we've made the decision, we've done something, we may retrospectively examine that decision, and then our conscience will be able to tell us, well, you better not do that again. Or, yes, that was the right thing. Paul said your conscience either accuses or excuses. So then, could we say that if an individual wanted to continue to have a good relationship with God, all they needed to do was follow their conscience? Maybe you've met people who think that way. Have you ever heard someone who say, well, you don't have to tell me, I've got a conscience, I just let my conscience be my God? But is that adequate? Is conscience alone sufficient to guide us so that we will, in fact, have a good relationship with God? To illustrate the point, I invite you to turn over to the book of Titus in the Bible, just before the book of Hebrews, Titus chapter 1. And there's an observation made here about an ancient people who lived on an island in the Mediterranean, the island of Crete, these Cretan people. And the Apostle Paul, in discussing the people of Crete, mentions a certain reputation that they had, and in fact he quoted a prophet from Crete to comment about them. Titus 1, verse 12, a certain one of them, their own prophet, said, Cretans are always liars, injurious wild beasts, unemployed gluttons. That's pretty hard language, isn't it? Imagine if someone said, why, Italians or Mexicans or Californians are always liars. And, I mean, we wouldn't like that. I mean, that'd be an awful generalization to make. In fact, I have a friend of mine, her name is Maria Karathanassis. She's in the Bethel in Athens, Greece, and she is by birth, and she grew up in Crete. And so I asked her, I said, Maria, what do the people of Crete think when they read here in the Bible that Cretans are always liars, injurious wild beasts, unemployed gluttons? And so she said, well, who said that? And I said, well, a Cretan prophet. And she said, well, if Cretans are always liars, then it's not true, is it? It seemed to me she was just sort of trying to evade the issue a bit. But the reason I bring this up is if Paul's statement is true, and we accept it, that all people have conscience, then that means that the people of ancient Crete also had conscience. But was their conscience adequate? Did it prevent them from being liars, unemployed gluttons, and injurious wild beasts? It didn't. There are other people, such as during the Second World War, in the Orient, in Europe, who did terrible, terrible things to prisoners in concentration camps or work camps. I mean, just inhumane cruelties that they performed. Now, the people who did that were normal people who theoretically had a conscience. But their conscience didn't prevent them under some pressured circumstance from doing those inhumane things. Hence, if we sincerely want to and should want to have a good relationship with God, obviously something more is needed than just saying, well, I've got a conscience. Something more is needed so that we can increase our improved or good relationship with God. What? Well, what we might do is focus on three things. If you'd like to write them down, we'll discuss each one of these three factors. And what we'll do is illustrate these three factors in the example of Donald, the brother that we were talking about who worked for this film laboratory. And then perhaps we can personally think about how you and I can apply these same three factors as we strive to have a good relationship with God. The first one is, what do the Scriptures say? You're going to face a decision. Maybe it's a decision you face at school. Should you join this club? Should you be part of this activity? What if all this group are going to go away on a field trip to here, do this or that? Your job. Your boss says, well, I'd like you to do this, this, and this. Or in the community. Maybe the other women in the area are asking you to become part of, or some relatives are visiting, or invite you to visit. They say, well, we're going to do this. It's a holiday. There are a lot of decisions to make in life. And one of the first things that a Christian, when faced with a decision, needs to think about is, what do the Scriptures say? Now that may come as no revelation. In fact, among people who are Jehovah's Witnesses or associated with them, it may be almost a natural, automatic response to consider the Scriptures. What does the Scripture say? And frankly, that is not a hard thing on matters where the Bible directly comments on it. You do it automatically. But just to illustrate, maybe, for example, your mother-in-law is coming for a visit, and she said she's going to visit for a week. That was 3 weeks ago, and she's still there, you know. And I never did particularly get along too well with your mother-in-law. And so it's a little bit difficult. And on the job, you're talking with your fellow worker, and you kind of grumble a little bit about your mother-in-law still there. You don't know when she's going to leave. And your fellow employee says, well, I'll tell you what, I know the solution to that situation. This is what I would suggest you do. Take your mother on a drive and get her halfway across the Bay Bridge, and then you just kind of get her out of the car and ease her off the side. Or even better, the Golden Gate Bridge, he said. You just kind of ease her off the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, you don't have to be a biblical scholar to know that that's not the way to deal with your mother-in-law. I mean, the Bible is very clear. It says, thou shalt not kill, and that does include mother-in-law. So it's not that sort of decision that it presents a problem for us, because that certainly would not help us to have a good relationship with God, to say nothing about our wife or our husband. But more problematic are the issues that are not so specifically dealt with in the Bible. At one time, when God was dealing with the nation of Israel, he provided over 600 laws. But for Christians, the number of specifically prohibited things much more restricted, much fewer specific laws in the Bible. For instance, you remember when the Christian governing body in Acts chapter 15, they were discussing an issue, and they concluded their discussion by saying that Christians absolutely must abstain from 3 things. What were those 3 things that Christians must abstain from? Anybody recall? Please. Right here.
From blood, things strangled, and things food sacrificed to idols.
All right, from blood, which would include things strangled, from things sacrificed to idols, and from, sister there, right?
Fornication.
Yes, fornication, from blood, and from things sacrificed to idols. Now that seems rather clear-cut. But in many other areas in life, what the Christian has to do is look for Bible principles that bear on it. Because if Donald For instance, he's in this situation. Let's just maybe elaborate on his situation. Here he is, he's working for the film processing laboratory, and these vacation pictures come in from your trip, and Donald feeds them through the processing machine, or maybe the printer, and he prints up the, a 4x6 print of each of your pictures, or mounts them in slides, and then they get sent back to you. Well, that's no particular problem. But then Donald's employer, his boss, starts to increase his profit margin by processing some triple X-rated film. Now Donald's got a decision to make. Am I going to run this X-rated film through my film processing machine? And so Donald says, well, let's see, what does the Bible say? But you know as well as I do that if he read the entire Bible faced with that problem, Donald would not find a single verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt or shalt not process triple or quadruple X-rated film. The Bible doesn't specifically mention it. But that doesn't mean that the Bible is silent on matters like that. There might be principles in the Bible that Donald could evaluate in making a decision. So let me ask you, what principles come to your mind in the Bible that someone like Donald might want to think about if now he's asked to process this X-rated film? Can you think of any Bible principles? This sister right here. I don't want you to reach a decision as to what Donald should do, but what principle? Go ahead.
Abstain from fornication.
All right. Another sister right here in the black.
These things shouldn't even be mentioned among you.
Okay, in Colossians it talks about immorality and fornication. It says these things should not even be mentioned among you, brother.
Not to be unevenly yoked with the unbeliever.
2 Corinthians 6 there. Brother here. Brother, right there, yes.
Not stumbling our brothers.
Another one?
Philippians 15:33, bad association spoils you from others.
Lord God and principle, sister.
Be babes as to babbles.
Thank you. Brother, slim mustache back there.
To deaden your body members respecting fornication.
Thank you. Another one here. Any other principles that you think of?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Any other principles? Another one from this sister?
That we must be giving Jehovah sacrifices clean and pure, and if our mind is dirty.
Don't reach your conclusion. I just want the principle. The principle. Brother against the...
Philippians 4, keeping our mind on chaste things.
Excellent. Yeah, whatever things are chaste and lovable, consider these things. Maybe Matthew 5, 27, 28, where it says, whoever keeps looking at a woman so as to commit adultery with her has already done so in his heart. Here, can't you see Donald processing this? But now those are some of the relevant Bible principles that Donald might think about. How about opening your Bible to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and maybe we'll get Brother DiGiulio to read here. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we'll read a verse and see if you think this principle is relevant to Donald's situation. Bob, would you read verse 8, please?
Certainly, if anyone does not, is that in 1 Timothy?
5, verse 8, yes.
Certainly, if anyone does not provide for those who are his own, and especially for those who are members of his household, he has disowned the faith and is worse than a person without faith.
And do you think that principle has any bearing on Donald's situation? Sister, what do you think?
Donald's leaving his job, so he still needs to perform.
Well, maybe he hasn't left it yet. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, no, do you think this is appropriate? He's trying to decide, should I stay here, should I leave?
Absolutely.
Why is it relevant?
Because he has to provide for his family.
Precisely. He can't say, forget it, I'm quitting. No, he's got a wife, he's got a son, and this principle bears on the matter. It also illustrates that when we face a decision, we needn't necessarily think that all of the Bible principles are going to all stack up on one side and say, this is what you must do. Maybe there are some principles that say, well, it would be, there's reasons to avoid it, but there might be some other principles that might seem to allow for it. And what we need to do is consider the entire range of Bible principles about what I'm supposed to do in school, or what I'm supposed to do on the job, or in the community, or with my relatives who are not in the truth. To consider all of the Bible principles, and then reach a conclusion. But let me ask you, how about in a situation like that, Donald's going up to some mature brother and saying, now, brother, this is my situation. I'm employed at this film processing lab, and outline the problem, and then ask him, this mature brother or sister, about the situation. Do you think that would be appropriate?
Certainly not. We have to shoulder our own responsibilities before Jehovah.
Now, it would not be inappropriate to go and do what we just did here in the congregation. In effect, ask somebody for additional Bible principles. Maybe to go and explain to the mature brother, my situation is this and this and this. And now here are the Bible principles that I've been able to think of that bear on it. Can you think of any additional Bible principles that might help me? That wouldn't be wrong. In fact, you might even say, could you help me do some research on it? Maybe he takes me to his theocratic library or at the Kingdom Hall. We use the index, look up some articles on pornography or employment, and find in them additional principles. That is not wrong. In fact, it may be very, very helpful. But as the brother correctly said, what we wouldn't want to say is, now, I know you can't make my decision. I don't want you to make my decision for me. But what I'd like to know is if you were in my situation, what would you do? Because in effect, that would be asking him to decide for us. We would be asking him to perform a medical miracle that they have not yet successfully performed, and that is a conscience transplant. I mean, they transplant corneas, kidneys, heart, but nobody successfully before God has performed a conscience transplant, and we shouldn't want it to be done. Instead, we should try to accumulate all of the relevant Bible principles and then think, now, in the light of all of these, what should I do, according with my conscience also, so that I continue to have a good relationship with God in the decision I make? Let's consider factor number 2. How will my decision affect others? That's the second factor. How will my decision affect others? Now, in order to illustrate this, I'd like to use the example we find, the real-life example in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. You turn there, we'll read quite a bit of it, but basically, the situation in ancient Corinth was there were a lot of pagan temples. And people would come to these pagan temples, they would offer a sacrifice to the gods, the idol statues in these temples, and then they would eat some of the food from the sacrifice, and maybe the priest of the temple would eat some of the meat of that sacrifice, and the person doing that would feel that somehow he was communing with the god, and that would, he thought, would help him. For instance, in ancient Corinth, there was one temple, the temple of Asclepius. This was the god of healing. Probably you've seen this god had a staff with a snake that goes up it, the healing god. And in fact, that symbol is still used for Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and other medical things, a stick with a snake going up, healing. So now, people might go. Maybe they had a bad hip or they had a bad sinus problem, and they would go to the temple of Asclepius and offer a sacrifice and hope that by doing that and eating some of the food of that sacrifice, that they would receive some benefit. And remember, as the brother correctly pointed out, one of the things the governing body said was that Christians must abstain from things sacrificed to idols. Christians could not do that and be Christians. But Paul, here and elsewhere, explained that in reality that idol in itself is nothing. It's just a dumb piece of stone and wood. And sometimes the priest of the temple, if they had excess meat from it, they might just take it down to the meat market and sell it there. And anybody who came along in the meat market buying a piece of meat, maybe it was meat from there. And Paul said it doesn't bother anybody because it's just meat. It's not contaminated with botulism or something just because it had come from that temple. If you didn't know it came from the temple, you're not eating it as something devoted to a god. But a real problem arose, and I'd like to illustrate it for you. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 says, "Now concerning the eating of foods," this is verse 4, "concerning the eating of foods offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and there is no God but one." Verses 5 and 6, he says, "There's only really one true God, the Father, through whom we are worshiping." But verse 7, "Nevertheless, there is not this knowledge in all persons, but some, being accustomed unto now to the idol, eat food as something sacrificed to an idol. To them, that food to the idol is very, very meaningful." Then in verse 8, Paul says, "But food will not commend us to God. If we do not eat, we do not fall short, and if we eat, we have no credit to ourselves. But keep watching that this authority of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to those who are weak." Observe now, Paul is talking about something that might cause stumbling. He's not talking about a disfellowshipping offense. He says, here's something that you might stumble or offend somebody else. Then in verse 10, he gets to what is a very, very difficult verse to understand. You see what I mean. Paul says, "If anyone should see you, the one having knowledge, reclining at a meal in an idol temple, will not the conscience of that one who is weak be built up to the point of eating food offered to idols?" Now I say that's a difficult verse because when you think about it, that decision of the governing body said that Christians must abstain from things sacrificed to idols. So if a person, a Christian, was regularly going to a prostitute's house and committing fornication with a prostitute unrepentantly, what would happen? He'd be disfellowshipped, would he not? Appropriately so. But now, what about a Christian's going into a temple and eating food sacrificed to idols? He'd be disfellowshipped too, wouldn't he? Why then is Paul talking about stumbling? He says, if someone should see you, the one having knowledge, reclining at a meal in an idol temple, wouldn't that be a disfellowshipping offense? Why does he say it's just something for stumbling? Well, some archaeological excavations have apparently shed light on it. They have found in ancient Corinth the temple precinct of the god Asclepius, where they had the statue where people would offer sacrifices. And associated with it, connected in the same temple area, there was a section where around the perimeter of this courtyard were a series of dining rooms. And in each dining room, there was a little charcoal pit area where people could eat meat. And so if somebody went and offered a sacrifice to Asclepius, and then they had a piece of the leg or something, and they could come out and they would cook it in one of these dining rooms, and they would eat it there, thinking that in that way they were communing with the god Asclepius. And Paul's, obviously, the conclusion of the governing body is, you cannot do that and be a Christian. However, they have also found invitations showing that these dining rooms around this courtyard could also be rented for non-religious activities. And that the person who rented one of these rooms and had a meal there would not necessarily be a worshiper of the god Asclepius. To illustrate, I don't know about out here in California, but down back in the area of New York State where I came from, that oftentimes after a wedding, the family would rent the upstairs room of a fire department, and they would have a wedding reception there. Do they do that out in the West here? You could just rent it, and just renting that room and having a wedding reception there over the fire apartment, that didn't make you a fireman, did it? You just rented it for the evening, and that was all there was to it. Well, similarly, someone could rent one of these rooms, these dining rooms in this temple precinct of Asclepius, without being a worshiper of Asclepius. Let's illustrate it this way. Say in ancient Corinth. In ancient Corinth, there was a married couple who regularly worshipped this pagan god Asclepius. And we'll just take a local couple here, a couple of pagans, as you probably know. Lois is her name, by the way. Lois and her husband are regular devotees of Asclepius. But also in Corinth, associated as part of the Christian congregation, we have one of the elders, in fact, in the Christian congregation, James, and his wife, Eunice. And one day, Eunice happens to meet Lois, this pagan worshiper of Asclepius, and starts witnessing to Lois. And of course, Lois, she's convinced that if she wants to get over her trouble with her knee, or have more children, or whatever the health problem, then she's got to continue to worship Asclepius. But Eunice is worshiping, witnessing to her about the one true God, Jehovah, the creator of heaven and earth. And gradually Lois becomes interested. And Eunice continues to visit her and explain the truth. Her husband, he's just a hard-necked pagan, and he just wants to continue worshiping Asclepius, and it's good for his business. You see, he's in one of these new businesses, his communication business, and his employer and others go down and worship Asclepius, and so he's going to continue. And he wants Lois to do the same. But Eunice witnesses to her, and gradually Lois becomes convinced that Jehovah is the true God who demands exclusive devotion, and she wants to have a relationship with God. And so Eunice shares with her the decision of the governing body that no Christian can be partaking of sacrifices to idol gods. So finally, Lois makes a decision. She's going to stop. And her husband, that hard-necked pagan, he really throws a fit, slaps her around him. He's a rough guy. But she is resolute. She starts coming to Christian meetings, continued study, and eventually Lois gets baptized. Very, very sad. And Eunice and James, her elder there, he's very, very pleased. She's new, she's weak, but she is now a Christian sister. But then a rather unusual situation arises because James, his brother, who's an atheist, he doesn't believe in any God, is going to get married. And after the wedding, they're going to have a wedding meal or feast, a reception. And James, his brother, decides to rent one of these rooms in this temple precinct of the temple of Asclepius. And he sends an invitation to James and Eunice. And, they're real nervous about that because they want to stay all the way away from false religion. But James's brother says, now look, Jimmy, there's nothing wrong with this because I'm not worshiping Asclepius. I don't even believe in any God. I'm not religious the way you are. It's just going to be a family meal there, and we simply rented that dining room for a few hours, and please come. I want you to meet my new wife and her family. James and Eunice, they talk it over, and they decide, well, since it's not religious in any way, we'll go. And maybe in the future we'll be able to help his brother and his new wife and so on. So they go. And they're reclining at this meal in this dining room at the temple of Asclepius. And who do you think walks by? Lois, our new weak sister. Now, what do you think Lois is going to think about this elder and his wife reclining at a meal in the temple of Asclepius? In fact, that's what Paul says here in verse 10. For if anyone should see you, Jimmy, James, and your wife Eunice, the ones having knowledge, reclining at a meal in an idol temple, will not the conscience of that one, Lois, who's weak, be built up to the point of eating foods offered to idols? You can see Lois, why, that James James and Eunice, what a bunch of hypocrites they are. They told me that I couldn't worship there at Asclepius. My husband slapped me around. He's such a brute, but I refused. And now look, I see them down there eating at the temple of Asclepius. Why? That's the end of that. I'm never going back to that congregation anymore. Next time my husband wants me to go down there with him, I'm going to go. You can see it happening, couldn't you? But I ask you, technically, did James and Eunice do anything wrong? They're not worshiping Asclepius. There's nothing technically wrong from a strict, absolute legal, biblical standpoint. They haven't done anything wrong. But the problem is, what is the effect on other people of what they have done? Paul goes on, really, by your knowledge, the man, or in this case the woman, that is weak is being ruined, your sister for whose sake Christ died. And when you people thus sin against your sisters and wound their conscience that are weak, you are sinning against Christ. Therefore, Paul says, if food makes my sister stumble, I'll never again eat flesh at all that I may not make my sister stumble. So it's not simply then a matter of technically if what I'm doing, is it right or wrong? Is there a specific law in the Bible saying do or don't do this thing? But what is the effect on other people in my doing? For instance, here with Donald. Donald might think, well, now, I don't own this business. I'm just an employee. I'm just running this film processor. Just like if I was working at the local Safeway store, and I'm just checking things out, zipping them over this scanner where it reads that little label on them and runs up a price. Well, so what if someone brings a pack of cigarettes by? Zip, zip. I'm not promoting cigarettes. James might think, Donald might think that way. But Donald also ought to be thinking, now I've got a 14-year-old son, and I'm telling my son not to go down there to 42nd Street to that porno movie houses, but what if my son finds out that in the lab where I work, we process those films? What is the potential effect on my son, my wife, Bible students that I'm trying to wean away from pornography? Or see, what is the effect on other people? Thus, in connection with the decisions that you or I have to make, and there are many of them, we can't think simply in terms of, is this technically right or wrong, which we must do. What does the Bible say about it? But then secondarily, next, what is the potential effect on other people? Because if we are in fact stumbling other people, what does the account there say? We are sinning against Christ. And if we should be sinning against Christ, what is that doing with our relationship? Now, point number 3, if you'd like to write it down. How will it affect me? Factor number 3, how will it affect me?